The phone rang while I was folding towels, and I almost let it go to voicemail because that's what I do. I let things go. I have let things go for 8 years, and I used to call that peace. It was Renata, my husband's older sister. We spoke maybe 4 times a year, always through him, always secondhand. So when her name lit up my screen directly, my first thought wasn't, why is she calling? It was, something is wrong. I'm not trying to start anything, she said, before I'd even said hello properly. I just need to understand why you didn't want to come to Mom's 60th. Everyone's asking, and I don't know what to tell them. I stood there with a towel half folded in my hands. Renata, I said, what invitation? There was a pause. The kind of pause where you can hear someone recalculating everything they thought they knew. Marcus told us 3 weeks ago, she said slowly, that you weren't comfortable coming, that you'd had a rough time at the last family thing and needed space. I had never heard about the party. Not the date, not the location, not one word. I told her that plainly, the way I tell most things, without heat, without accusation, just the flat truth laid on the table between us. And I could hear something shift in her voice. Not anger, recognition, like a puzzle piece had just turned over and shown her the picture on the other side. Oh, she said. Oh, that's okay. I need to think about something. Can I call you back? She hung up before I could answer. I went back to the towels. That's who I was then. Marcus and I met when I was 26. I was already the quiet one in most rooms. Not shy exactly, just economical. I chose words like they cost something. He was the opposite. Warm, quick, the kind of person who could walk into his mother's kitchen and diffuse an argument in 90 seconds with a joke and a compliment. I loved that about him. 2 years in, I noticed he'd started doing that thing with me too, smoothing me over before I even got the chance to say what I meant. The first time I remember clearly, we were engaged. His mother asked in front of everyone whether I planned to keep working after the wedding, in a tone that made it sound like a test I might fail. I said carefully, I haven't decided yet. I like my job. We'll see. Later that night, his mother told me how glad she was that I'd finally made peace with staying home for a while. I hadn't said that. I hadn't come close to saying that. When I asked Marcus about it, he shrugged and said, I softened it a little. She gets anxious about that stuff. It's easier this way. It's easier this way. I would hear that sentence so many times over the next 8 years that it stopped registering as strange. It became weather. Something you just walked through. Then there was the miscarriage, the year I turned 32. I told Marcus I wasn't ready to talk to his family about it yet, that I needed time. He said he understood. 3 weeks later, his mother sent me a card that said she understood I'd processed things privately and was doing better now. I hadn't processed anything. I'd barely started. And when I asked him how she even knew, he touched my shoulder and said, I just gave her the short version. It's easier this way. The same words, the same gentle override, and I let it go because each one, on its own, looked like nothing. A husband smoothing a rough edge. A translator softening a hard truth for people he loved. I told myself that for years, because the alternative, that my own words were being quietly replaced with his, was too strange a thing to hold. So I stopped saying the hard things directly. What was the point, if they'd arrive at their destination changed anyway? I got quieter. He got smoother. And somewhere in that trade, I disappeared from every room I wasn't standing in. Renata called back 2 days later. This time I sat down first. I talked to Mom, she said. And then I talked to Marcus. And then I started asking around because something felt off. And, Elena, I think you need to hear what people think you've said over the years. Because it's a lot. And none of it sounds like you. She read me a list. Not maliciously. Carefully. Like she was handing me something breakable. That I'd found the annual reunion exhausting and preferred to skip most years. That I'd said his father's health scares were dramatic. That I'd told Marcus I found his mother difficult to be around, in those exact words, more than once. That I'd turned down hosting Thanksgiving because it wasn't really my thing. when the truth was I'd offered to host, genuinely, and the offer had traveled 3 miles and arrived as a refusal. That I'd told his brother he shouldn't be trusted with money, when all I'd said, quietly to my husband alone, was that he should be careful about co-signing another loan. I had said versions of some of these things. Once, tired in our kitchen, in the specific privacy of a marriage, not for circulation, not as a verdict to be delivered. The rest I hadn't said at all. They were guesses dressed as quotes, assumptions that had hardened into fact because nobody ever checked them against the source. Why didn't anyone ever just ask me? I said. Renata was quiet for a moment. Because he always answered first. He's easy to talk to. You were always a little harder to reach. It was simpler to ask him about you than to ask you. It was simpler to ask him about you than to ask you. I had built a version of myself so quiet, so agreeable, so careful not to cause friction, that an entire family had stopped considering me a source on my own life. I didn't confront Marcus that first night. I sat with it. I went back through 8 years in my head, and the image that kept surfacing was this. The number of times I'd driven to a family event alone, him arriving separately from work, our 2 cars crossing paths on the same road without ever actually meeting. I used to think that was just scheduling. Now I wondered how much of our lives had been running on intersecting roads that never quite touched. I called him from the kitchen doorway. I remember standing exactly there, 1 foot in the room, 1 foot out, the way I'd stood at the edge of so many conversations that were technically about me. I need you to explain something, I said, and I need you not to make it smaller than it is. He knew immediately what I meant. I watched it land on his face, not the surprise of a man caught in something new, but the tired recognition of a man who'd known this conversation was coming for a long time and had simply hoped it wouldn't. I was trying to protect you, he said. You hate confrontation. My mom pushes, my brother pushes, and you'd get that look, and I started handling it, so you wouldn't have to. You didn't ask me if I wanted it handled. Would you have wanted to have those conversations? Honestly, it was a fair question, and I hated that it was fair. Maybe I wouldn't have wanted to. Maybe, given the choice, I would have let him do exactly what he did. But that was the point I made him sit with. He never gave me the choice. He decided on my behalf what I could and couldn't handle, and then he built a version of me that could handle it instead. A more agreeable Elena, a softer, more convenient one. And that Elena went to family dinners in my place for 8 years, while the real one stayed quiet in the passenger seat, then eventually got left at home entirely. He didn't have a villain's answer. That was almost the hardest part. He wasn't managing me out of contempt. He was managing conflict, the way he'd always managed conflict. And I had simply become one more difficult conversation he'd learned to route around instead of through. I'm not angry that you love peace, I told him. I'm angry that you built it out of me. I went to the 60th birthday. I drove there in the same car as Marcus for once, instead of arriving separately down 2 different roads. I called his mother directly, and when she started to say something about how Marcus had told her I felt a certain way, I said gently but clearly, I'd rather tell you myself. If that's all right? She went quiet. Then she asked. It was the first real question she'd asked me in years. At the dinner table, when his brother made a comment referencing something I'd said about the loan, I corrected it myself in the moment, calmly. Marcus started to jump in, old habit, fast reflex, and I put my hand lightly on his arm. Not a scene, just a boundary, small and physical and clear. I've got this one. He stopped. It cost him something to stop. I could see that. 8 years of being the fixer doesn't unlearn itself over one dinner. We're still married. This is the harder, less satisfying kind of ending, the kind where 2 people who still love each other have to slowly rebuild something that was never as sturdy as it looked. We started seeing someone together, an hour every other week, mostly to practice letting a sentence land the way it was actually said. It's slower than either of us expected. Old habits don't announce themselves. They just quietly try to pick up where they left off, and half the work now is simply noticing when they do. Renata and I talk more now, directly, without him in the middle. What I lost in those 8 years wasn't just a few misquoted sentences. It was the version of me that other people were allowed to know directly. A reputation built entirely out of a stranger's careful edits, agreeable and invisible and never quite mine. Getting that back isn't a single confrontation or a clean apology. It's answering my own phone. It's finishing my own sentences before anyone else can finish them for me. I still don't love conflict. I don't think I ever will. But I've learned there's a difference between choosing quiet and disappearing into it. And for the first time in a long while, when someone asks who I am, I'm the one who answers.